Hello, good night. Today our guest is Professor Andrew Fraser. Hello, Professor Fraser. How are you doing?
Hello, how are you?
I'm great. So, Andrew, some time ago I was online and I saw a piece written by you titled Global Jesus versus Local Jesus.
Oh,
And it has two parts, a part one and a part two.
yeah.
Andrew, what motivated you to write that article? Isn't Jesus a global figure in history?
If there's a kind of a dispute in academic theology, I suppose, between those who really want to focus on the historical Jesus and those who are rooted more in the Western Augustinian tradition and who want to think of a global Jesus. And personally, I think the argument for a historical national Jesus is just much more potent and true.
Jesus was a Jew, and that this argument again is against the backdrop of Jesus and his role in Judaism. Some would argue that the resurrection of Christ is significant for the Jewish people and not people more broadly. What are your views?
Um, well, I mean, first of all, Judaism is like a contested term in itself. I mean, the idea of Judaism didn't exist before the second century BC, and that was associated with the Maccabean revolt. What Judaism in that context meant was a kind of an anti-colonial struggle against Hellenism. Okay, and so really the whole and E. Michael Jones makes this point too, that the whole, even in that context, the whole meaning of what it meant to be a Jew changed during the Jesus Christ in that
Repeat,
sense,
Andrew,
like
please repeat your last statement. You said that the meaning of Judaism changed when?
during the advent of Jesus, essentially after the advent of Jesus. I mean, before Judaism, before that, being a Jew meant being someone who lived in Judea, and who participated in all the temple cult rituals and so on. But after the advent of Christ and leading up to the crucifixion and the resurrection, there was a contest between those Jews who wanted Jesus to be like a secular king who would beat back the Romans in the same way that the Maccabees sought to do with the Greeks, and those who saw him rather as the fulfillment of Israel's covenantal telos, in a sense, which really required the end of the temple cult. Does that
Andrew,
make sense?
yes. The Maccabees, that's an interesting story. So when I was a toddler, I had a relative who frequented the Anglican church, and in his particular Anglican church, the priest had some books that were not included in the Bible. So as a young boy, I was fascinated by these stories. Book of is it Judith or Judith?
Sorry?
No, there are several books that claim to be biblical, but they're not included in the Bible.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
so and I'm trying to remember the name of one of these books. I'm wondering if is it the book of Judith?
Um, ring a bell to
Yeah,
me.
let me look it up. Yes, book of Judith. This is one of the books that are not included in the Bible. So at that time, I was really interested in these texts. But moving on, Andrew, what do we mean by Judeo-Christian ethics?
Well, Judeo-Christian ethics to me is a nonsense term. I mean, I don't believe there is any such thing as Judeo-Christianity. I mean, Judaism is a religion, if you like, that an ethno-religion that only came into being after in the centuries after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. And it was conceived as essentially in opposition to Christianity. I mean, in that rabbinic Judaic tradition founded on the Talmud, Jesus Christ is not the Son of God. So, and Jews refuse to recognize him as the Son of God.
I think that
So, I mean, it's kind of a nonsense to. I mean, the whole concept of Judeo-Christianity dates, I believe, the earliest people to use that term were sometime in the mid-19th century and only really gained currency post-World War II.
I think it's unwise to conflate Judaism and Christianity. They're similar religions. They both have a history of freedom, but some would argue that the West is predicated on Judeo-Christian ethics for political reasons. And I think we should separate both religions. They're distinctive religions.
I agree
Yeah,
entirely.
there are many on the right who object to the notion of Judeo-Christian ethics. And some of these thinkers are not necessarily religious, and I don't blame them.
Yeah.
You don't need to esteem Judaism by lumping it with Christianity.
Yeah. And indeed, I mean, one of the paradoxes in that concept of Judeo-Christian ethics is that, I mean, those Christians who espouse that notion would be the first people to reject any idea that Christianity, Anglo-Saxon Christianity, for example, could be seen as an ethno religion, and in other words, I mean, for them, Christianity is a universal kind of religion, whereas Judaism is almost obviously a highly ethnocentric religion. So, and it obviously accepts the ethical norm of ethnocentrism, which is seen almost as sinful by your typical mainstream Christian today.
The scholar David Novak, I'm fond of his work, but I do believe that he will see the merit in some of your arguments, because David Novak is in favor of Judaism being a local religion that ought to be affirmed by the Jewish people. He's a proponent of Jewish pride.
Yeah. And it would be hard to find a Jew, religious or secular, who isn't in favor of Jewish pride.
Well, there's an academic. I read him all the time. I consider him to be a mentor somewhat, and we were corresponding via email. He's Jewish. He attends the synagogue, but he has a problem with fellow Semitism, and he has no issue reading people who are critical of Jews. But I won't say his name on the show.
Yeah.
Yes, but
Yeah.
he has little patience for the Jew obsessed intellectual, and he also shares the view that Jewish people are overly represented in destructive movements.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and there are, I mean, that's not an entirely unknown position among some Jews these days. That's true. You know,
Yeah, and this
I mean, there
person,
are many.
you may go
Go ahead.
ahead. Now we're just about to say, and
Yeah,
this person is a scholar who really respects his religion, but he has no problem with critiquing it. He's self-critical.
yeah. Well, I feel the same way about Anglo-Saxon Christianity or Anglicanism. I mean, I am highly critical of contemporary Anglicanism,
And
or indeed,
you should be critical
yes,
of contemporary Anglicanism because some of
yeah,
these Anglicans don't really act like Christians.
yes, that's
Same-sex
true.
marriage is not biblical. The revisionists would want us to believe that the issue of homosexuality was only pertinent in the Old Testament. There are actually some serious people writing books arguing that the Bible does not condone homosexuality, but this is not
Mhm.
true.
Yes, I mean, I certainly agree with that. Yes,
And
yeah.
I well I believe that I believe that I said earlier that as a toddler my cousin attended an Anglican church. So I have nothing against Anglican. It's just that I'm a bit critical of their liberalism.
Mhm.
Christianity, as one scholar noted years ago, is a religion. And when Christian philosophy is appropriate to solve the problems of the world, it is no longer Christianity.
Yeah. That's true, and I mean one of the points I was trying to make in that article on global Jesus versus national Jesus is that really we do need to think about the meaning of the Bible. I find it really quite ironic that especially low church Anglicans always describe themselves as Bible believing, but they are terribly, fiercely resistant to any sort of biblical hermeneutic or interpretation of the Bible that suggests, for example, that the Bible story comes to an end in AD 70 and that all the biblical prophecies including the parousia or the so-called second coming of Christ, were fulfilled in AD 70. That the heaven and earth that ended in AD in Revelation were the heaven and earth of old covenant Israel, and that post AD 70, a whole new world opens up that was it became that in which I mean in the West at least Augustine really sought to interpret the Bible as a narrative that had not yet reached its conclusion, which I think has become kind of the basis for the universalist nature of contemporary Christianity. And I think it's based upon a false biblical hermeneutic that has been challenged by a school of biblical scholars known as the preterist from the Latin term meaning past praetor. And they can also be described as promoting the idea of a covenant eschatology, which was fulfilled in AD 70. And if that reading of the Bible is accurate, credible, and indeed true, we really do need to rethink the whole nature of our biblical theology. I mean, perhaps the Bible really is a kind of a warrant for other nations to try to model themselves on ancient Israel by becoming a holy nations themselves with their own history. And indeed, as I was arguing in that paper, they're treating their own history as the basis for their own sort of national Bible, if you like.
The Bible is a philosophical and ethical tome providing guidelines as to how one should live. So many
Yeah.
biblical precepts have been confirmed by modern knowledge. So,
Yeah.
for instance, men and women cannot have sex like men. They're more likely to become emotionally invested in relationships. And in the Bible, the sexuality of women is regulated. I I perceive the Bible in this light. God is real, and but all biblical stories could be untrue, yet the power of God is not invalidated.
Mhm. I think that's true, and I don't think there's any problem, whatever, in seeing the Bible as a powerful myth or a powerful collection of myths. For example, I mean, just to take the beginning at the beginning in Genesis. I mean, I don't think there's any reason why we should think of the Genesis 1, for example, as having to do with the creation of planet Earth. Rather, there are it seems much more credible to me to think of it as a kind of a way in which the Israelites sought to understand the world, the heaven and earth, in a sense, as a kind of a cosmic temple. They weren't trying to do paleogeology. Similarly, there's no reason why one has to think of Adam as the first human being. I mean, why isn't it more credible to think of him as, in a sense, a kind of a mythical figure standing, in a sense, for Israel itself?
So Andrew, we're touching on some rather tricky ground at the moment, because earlier I noted that the Anglican Church was dismissing certain important biblical precepts, and we referred to homosexuality. But now we're both agreeing that the Bible ought to be understood as a philosophical and ethical tome. So,
Mhm.
by making this argument, are we undercutting our previous thesis? I just want your opinion.
I don't think that we are. I mean, it seems to me, that you were saying the Bible is a kind of a kind of a narrative that provides us with certain lessons, moral, historical, and otherwise. And that doesn't mean that the people that the Bible was written by people who were just scribes, in effect, writing down a dictation coming from God. Personally, it was an attempt by a people to understand who they were, where they came from, and where they were going, and what sort of life they ought to lead to fulfill whatever the divine mission they were per, following, attempting to fulfill.
Exactly. So we can reconcile the moral philosophy of the Bible with it being primarily metaphorical. On the one hand, that the Bible is a metaphorical text, but it's also a moralistic text. So
Yeah,
this is how we would solve the problem.
yeah, and not just on the individual or even familial level, but on the national level too. I mean, to me, I mean, the Bible is the story of a particular nation and its historical experience, its origins, development, and indeed final end. And to the extent that that's true, it's a kind of, as I was saying, a kind of a warrant for any other nation that wants to see itself as having a kind of covenantal relationship with the divine. It's a store of wisdom, as you're suggesting, and it's also a very powerful warning as to what can happen to a nation that rejects, in a sense, its kind of mandate or covenantal obligations to the divine.
The Bible and freedom. This is what I'm presently pondering in my mind. Is the Bible a libertarian text?
I would not say. I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by libertarian. But if that means focusing on the liberty of the individual, I would say definitely not.
Yes, the Bible affords primacy to the autonomy of the individual, but it also supports the common good.
Yes.
My term is objective pragmatism. Precepts recommended by the Bible induce human flourishing and they're pragmatic.
Yeah.
So, for
I
example,
agree.
the health message of the Bible, or property rights in the Bible, or the
Mhm.
concept of what some would call decentralization today. Remember, Augustine once argued that the state is a necessary evil.
Mhm.
The Bible, I would not describe it as a contemporary libertarian text, but it's certainly not a friend of the state.
Not afraid of the state. Is that
Yes,
what you said?
yeah,
Yeah.
not a friend of the state.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, and insofar as that is true, it is a powerful source of wisdom for contemporary Anglo-Saxons who really are now a stateless people.
We're getting to
Much,
this conversation. We're going to get to this topic soon. But before we do
yeah,
so, we have to speak briefly about Saint Augustine. Why is he so
yeah.
important? I'm a big fan.
Why is he so important? I think he is vitally important in the history of Western civilization because how would you put it? Because in a sense, he managed to translate the Bible, biblical narrative, into the experience of other peoples in the Mediterranean world. And as I said before, I mean, I think the kind of meta narrative he provides is no longer useful for us, but looked at in its historical context, he in effect enabled Christians to understand themselves as a new race, altogether just a third race distinct from the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans, a fourth race, let's say. So that and that enabled a kind of a self-consciously, it enabled the birth and development of a self-consciously Christian civilization, which then, over the course of the first millennium, became the kind of seedbed for the development of self-consciously Christian nations. For example, I mean, the most important in my mind, being England, which modeled itself, the England in the age of Alfred the Great, self-consciously modeled itself on ancient Israel. And they did so because they saw themselves as being part of that civilization that Augustine described, and gave a kind of a sense of destiny to.
Augustine, our first major world historian.
Yeah, that's right. And he was the, what would you say, he gave us that image of a kind of a global Jesus, which made sense in a world where these embryonic European nations were more or less isolated, one from other civilizations, the Chinese, whatever. But now, where we live in a world where it's quite clear that other civilizations exist, sometimes in open enmity to our own, we really do need to rethink that Augustinian meta-narrative, and perhaps go back and take the Bible on its own Hebrew terms.
But Augustine was a psychologist, anthropologist, and sociologist all in one. And then his writing is so romantic, so sublime. Whenever, I'm not an emotional person, but whenever I'm reading St. Augustine, I just feel like crying. I don't actually cry, but I just feel like crying.
Yes, his confessions are.
He's magical. Even when you're reading a second-hand source of St. Augustine, it's just utterly magical.
Yeah, yeah. He was an inspired writer, I think you'd have to say.
And he was also so simple and lucid. This is someone who wrote on the state. He discussed the problem of dreams. A first-rate thinker. It's just unfortunate that presently we're not in the peak of studying St. Augustine. Obviously, St. Augustine is a more ancient philosopher and more people have emerged, but I think we need to revisit the Augustinian roots of the West.
Yeah, although his notion that kingdoms are but great robberies, is becoming ever more relevant.
Yeah, the state is a necessary evil.
Yeah,
it exists because of sin, and we can't mention Augustine again without talking about the problem of evil and how we defined it as a form of privation, the absence of good. And I'm making this point because some time ago there was an artwork, not a Jamaican artwork, but Jamaica was once under British rule, and the artwork depicted a painting of a white angel stepping on a black devil or a man who looked burnt. And it created some fracas in Jamaica, and the photo was actually removed. It was part of the official, it was a part of the official attire of the Office of the Governor General. So the photo was removed. I didn't pay much attention to the story because as someone with only a cursory understanding of art, I'm more interested in the philosophy of art. I do know that there are multiple paintings showing a white angel stepping on a white devil or a black devil. But because of the George Floyd issue, the matter was inflated. And then it went, my thoughts went right back to St. Augustine, who said that evil is a privation of good. And then I said, okay, black is a blank space. It's easier to look at
Yeah.
pink, blue, yellow, or green than black. So by invoking black to depict evil, this is not necessarily racist. It's just biology and common sense.
Yeah, yeah. Although, you know, one of the I've been thinking a lot about that, Augustine's notion of evil as a kind of privation, and I'm becoming more skeptical about that, because I mean, like, first of all, I mean, like, it's hard to reconcile that view with his view of creation, isn't it? I mean, and because Augustine understood creation as being creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. There was nothing before. God just creates the world, and that's it. And God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. God is ubiquitous. But and if that's the case, a fundamental problem, you know, that theologians have wrestled with for centuries, I guess, is, well, how come he's not responsible for the evil in the world?
Well, I like Augustine, but in the realm of theodicy, I subscribe to the natural law school. So my
Yeah,
own thoughts are a bit different.
yeah,
The world is governed by a natural law, and evil has upended the natural law. And as such, we're conforming to a new reality. God is omnipotent and great, but he's not going to intervene in world affairs to prevent us from harming ourselves.
yeah.
It's a
I,
bit more
I,
elaborate than that, but I subscribe to
yeah.
the natural law school. What about you?
Well, I just one of the reasons I've been rethinking all of that is I just became familiar in the last few years with something called
Process theology?
process theology. I
I'm
don't
not a
know
fan,
whether you've
Mr.
ever run across
Yes,
that.
Charles Althorne. I'm
Yeah.
quite familiar with it, but I'm not a fan.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And why not?
Why? So there's another philosopher. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, but he wrote a book called Christianity and Anarchy, and his last name is Ellul. It's French. Is it Jacques?
Oh, Jacques Ellul.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Jacques Ellul.
Okay.
So he is also
Yeah.
fond of process theology. In this book, Christianity and Anarchy, he argues God is great, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that God knows what will happen in the future.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm as an
I
evangelical, I'm not fond of process theology. But you can elaborate more for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's basically the idea. I mean, I guess one of the basic presuppositions of process theology is that the idea of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing, it isn't really. It's not biblical, first of all, and it also really does make it impossible. Well, hard to understand. For example, the kinds of interactions and the relationship between the Israelites and God in the Old, and indeed in the New Testament, where God doesn't seem to be omniscient, doesn't seem to even be consistent. He changes his mind on occasion. And if you think of creation as an ongoing process of interaction between the human and the divine, it makes it possible to account for the existence of evil, because God doesn't control everything. You know,
um, Andrew,
evil.
Andrew, I made
Uh,
an error. The professor's name is Charles Arthur, not
Sorry?
Charles. The professor of process theology, his name is Charles Arthur, not Charles Arthur. Two different people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But process theology has raised a challenge to evangelical Christians because they cannot reconcile the omnipotence of God with his perceived ignorance. As you
Yeah.
said, God is known to facilitate.
Yeah.
Now, Andrew, we can finally begin to discuss what you have been waiting to talk about. White people, WASP, yes.
Yeah.
Are whites a stateless people? I do agree.
Uh, well, well, I mean, depends. I mean, the
Let me,
term
you can go
white,
ahead and I'll
as
go
far
ahead.
as
Yeah, you may go ahead.
you made.
Yeah, you can go ahead and speak.
Okay, I was just going to say that the concept of white people, I think, is so thin. It that is practically meaningless. I mean, I really prefer to talk about particular ethnic group, Anglo-Saxons, Scots, Irish, French, Germans, Italians, and so it point of view. I mean, like if Israel was the kind of the medium through which God acted in the biblical world, then we as particular nations should see ourselves as a medium through which the divine acts in the process of theosis about. And so white people are they only came in. I remember when I studied American history, I came across this book by Winthrop Jordan, the title of which was White Over Black. And the one of the things that really struck me about his argument was that basically until Europe
All right. Yeah.
sub-Saharan
No, and Andrew,
Africans,
you have to
they
repeat.
had
Andrew.
no.
Yeah, Andrew,
Yep.
you have to repeat the last part. You said you Winthrop Jordan, the famous historian, and then you said something else.
Oh,
You,
yeah.
you were missing for a bit, so just repeat.
Okay. This book by Winthrop Jordan called White Over Black, he talks about the experience that Englishmen had when or the reaction that Englishmen had to their first encounters with Black sub-Saharan Africans. And it was the shock of that encounter, the shock of the difference between them and Africans, that really it wasn't until then that they actually thought of themselves as white. Prior to then, they were English or Protestants or whatever, and so and that's why I'm not really very keen on the idea of white
Yeah,
nationalism.
white is a popular term. I agree with you 100%. Then the nation state is also recent in history. So white is just a blanket term for Europeans who feel immiserated in Western society. That's why I noted earlier that I agree with you. But I get your point completely.
Yeah, and white. So I mean, whites as such are not a stateless people. Indeed, I
Philosophically,
mean, if
they are
you look
stateless.
at people like, yeah, well, I mean, what about the Jews? According to Jared Taylor, Jews are white too. they nowadays are definitely not a stateless people. They once were, but they are no longer. But Anglo-Saxons in the countries, the nations, the states, if you like, that they created, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, now are definitely stateless. None of those states even pretend any longer to and stock that created them,
Yeah,
and
repeat it. Hold on,
indeed
Andrew. So
are.
the Zoom was fizzling a bit. So far, the show has been good, but sometimes Zoom is problematic. You said that the offshoots of the English are stateless people, and then you were making another point. So just repeat that again, please.
Yeah, well, I was saying that, if you look at the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of those countries, all of those created by people of Anglo-Saxon stock, British descent, a bit more widely. But nowadays, not one of those states, not even including the United Kingdom itself, where England, the state there even, again, does not represent the English, much less the quote white
No,
British
and
unquote
in
people.
America, we have an excellent case study, or rather, should I say, multiple case studies of large corporation indoctrinating their employees into thinking that being white is a problem. Nowhere
Yes,
else in the world are people encouraged to disregard their ancestry, only in the Western world. You could not go
yes.
to China and say to people, stop teaching the ancient philosophers. The Japanese, during the Meiji Restoration, appropriated Western culture and institutions, but they retained their Japanese culture. Only
Mhm.
Western cultures are suffering from this problem.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
all about
And
indigenous ways of knowing.
and one of the major factors in, what could you say, the deracination of the Anglo-Saxon peoples or the Germans or the French or whatever is the global Christianity, the universalistic religion, that is not that not only is not, but positively eschews, rejects any notion that it should be grounded in the history and life and needs of particular peoples. Um, and so it's not just that we're stateless, we're churchless as well. The Anglican Church, as you were indicating earlier, is one of the chief culprits. They simply refuse to see themselves as the church of, by, and for the Anglo-Saxon peoples.
The West,
And if you can't get, yeah, go
Andrew,
ahead.
today, the West is encountering a new challenge that can be compared to terrorism. It's an intellectual form of terrorism, but I call it the invasion of the barbarians, where Western knowledge is being uprooted by people who are simply inarticulate and untrained. They want us to dump Immanuel Kant, to read feminists who literally think that their feelings constitute evidence.
Hmm. And who many of those people are in the formerly Anglo-Saxon countries. They are WASP elites. The
Protestants. Protestants again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I suppose there are
Protestants
some.
and their humanitarianism.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's not just Protestants. I mean, for example, I don't know whether you're familiar with the radical orthodoxy movement in academia, in theology. But I mean, the Anglo-Catholic branch or tendency, if you like, within the Anglican Church is even worse. Like John Milbank. I don't know whether you've
Yeah, I
ever
know
heard of
John
him.
Milbank. Yes, I know. He's
Yeah.
quite famous.
Well, he is a rabid Remainer, totally opposed to Brexit, who feels more kinship with Europeans than he does with his co-ethnics. I would say probably even in the UK, but certainly in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, like he wants back in Europe, and wouldn't and really why? I mean, this is the problem that that Anglo-Saxons have with our elites, because they are, there's a kind of a term in ethnic studies that describes the nature of ethnicities. You can be one ethnic group you can describe as a lateral ethnic. Another one you might describe as a vertical ethnic. The difference is that the first, the lateral ethnic, is sort of like the WASP elites. They are always been much more comfortable dealing with, I mean, let's say the aristocrats, the nobility in medieval England, found it much easier to deal with, especially after the Norman conquest, with their Norman peers, with the upper levels of the clergy, the warrior class, and so on. And in a sense, they imposed a kind of ethnic identity or a national identity on England. It did not come up, vertically up from above. And so, like in Canada, for example, one of the basic problems with the decline of the Anglo-Saxons in Canada is that the political elites in Canada have been perfectly comfortable dealing with pandering to, I would say, let's say, first of all, the French in Quebec at the expense of English Canadians, with Jews, with the various that. Oh, and it's pretty much true. I mean, look at the United Kingdom now. I mean, the top positions in the government of the UK are not even held by native white British people, much less English. I mean, so and that problem was in a sense sort of accentuated and intensified with the rise of the modern business corporation, which is this impersonal organizational form that has spawned a managerial professional class that prides itself on its cosmopolitanism.
So Andrew, so we're wrapping up, but these are my last words. I like the notion of Western civilization. I'm not white, I don't live in the West, but I will tell you that in many non-white countries, if the top positions were occupied by foreign elites, this would be cause for revolt. But in
Yeah.
white countries, the prime minister can be a black man from Africa, and it's not a problem. It's celebrated.
Yes.
White people are not allowed to express racial pride.
Yes. Yep.
And this is one of the, this is well particular, this is the major reason why I have some sympathy for white nationalists. And I'm not in favor of nationalism. I'm not a nationalist, but I do understand the plight of white nationalists.
Yeah.
So Andrew, I really enjoy our discussion, but these days I'm doing shorter shows, so I'm wrapping up. So bye, and it was a pleasure to speak to you, Andrew.
Yes, it was a pleasure to talk to you too.
All right.
And thanks for inviting me on.
Yes.
Bye-bye then.
Yes.